The other day I was in Japan and I learned a fact that surprised me. The Ise Grand Shrine is considered to be 1300 years old and yet is rebuilt every 20 years. To me, growing up in the West and being immersed with such a culture, I thought that this was impossible intuitively. How could something with different materials and not the same wood that once was there still be considered 1300 years old? It would just be a reproduction or a fake. But I knew that there must be some good reason for this, so I decided to do some research. In the Western tradition, we tend to think that buildings with history should have the same stones that once were there. For example, you can take the Parthenon in Athens, or the Colosseum in Rome. Those were the same stones that were there with the Romans' time, and we tend to place some sentimental value on those stones because they were there even when the Romans were there and when the Greeks were there. And we put values on the stones and on the wood and we tie history to those artifacts. Even if the form of the building completely falls apart, for example, the Parthenon, it's nowhere near as beautiful as it was 2,000 years ago. But we still tend to consider the Parthenon to be good looking. We still go there in droves to that tourist destination because those are the same stones that were there, even though the pattern and the form and the architecture and the proportions have completely been turned to rubble. For example, John Ruskin of England, writing in the Seven Lamps of Architecture, wrote that it is in that golden stain that we are to look for the real light and color and preciousness of architecture. What he meant by that was that the golden stain was the weathering on the buildings and the age that they showed and the toils that the original stones had taken over time. We're supposed to respect that fact. He was writing in the Seven Lamps of Architecture, which was one of a very influential English architectural book at the time that inspired a lot of Gothic revival. Now we can compare this to some of the Eastern tradition, or at least the Japanese tradition, where the shrine is built every 20 years and yet it is still called 1300 years old. The reason for this is that they want to preserve the spirit of the architecture. They want to preserve the proportions and how the space looks and the feel of it. And that spirit of the building is carried over no matter if the wood is the same wood that was there so long ago or if it was the same wood that's here now. They want to preserve the proportions of the building. They want to preserve the spirit of the building. They want to preserve the ideas and what the building stands for. Okakura Kakuzo wrote that in, I'm not butchering that, but he wrote that in his very popular early 20th century book, The Book of Tea, which discussed Japanese thoughts about aesthetics and proportions and about architecture and art and what Japanese tastes and those things mean. And he was writing to a Western audience to try to explain this. In the quote that I just said, he pretty much says directly, impermanence is not what they seek, but they seek to retain the quality of the room that suggests something greater. If the Parthenon used to suggest something greater, like some Japanese rooms do, it can't do that anymore because it's in such disrepair. But the stones are the same ones that touch the Greeks. In conclusion, in the West, the building's spirit lies in its stones, and in the East, it lies in the pattern or how it looks. These ideas can also correspond to some extent as how each tradition views the afterlife. In the West, in Christianity, it's seen as a very chronological thing. We are born, then we have our life, then we die and go to heaven or hell. Or if you're Catholic, I guess, I forgot it, limbo. And then there's the rapture and all the dead bodies come up from the graves and all. It's sort of an apocalyptic thing. So we tend to think of it as a chronological order. We tend to think that it's the same bodies. So we like to preserve that sameness, the same materials. We like that idea in the stones of the Colosseum, in the stones of the Parthenon, in the stones of St. Peter's Basilica. Whereas in Buddhism, the soul isn't as permanent. It's more of a pattern of being. The soul is just one aspect. For example, I think in Questions to King Milinda, which is a fundamental Buddhist text, it says that the soul is passed down from person to person, just like a fire is passed down from person to person. Not quite the same, not quite different. This follows through in the different architectural ideas of architecture and architectural preservation that each culture has. These two conflicting ideas are actually also expressed in the UNESCO World Heritage, because they allowed the Ise Grand Shrine to be rebuilt every 20 years and still considered a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that follows through with some other places too. So UNESCO is trying to be an East-West mixer. So in conclusion, in the East, the focus is put on the proportions and the idea of the room and the sanctity of the room. Whereas on the West, we put more focus on the stones of the room, or the material of the room, even if it falls into disrepair. So, and this corresponds somewhat to each area's idea of the afterlife. I hope you learned something.